ladies and gentlemen. We welcome all of you to the SkillsFuture Month in collaboration with Smart Nation 2021, organized by SkillsFuture Singapore and Smart Nation Singapore. Our speakers, Wayne and Hong Vu, will be sharing the topic, how to derive better business decisions with data. Throughout the session, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A tab that you see on the right panel. Do take note, questions will be moderated. Wayne and Hong Vu, please go ahead.
All right. Hi, good afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time of your afternoon to join us, to join General Assembly for this particular webinar on how to drive better business decisions with data. My name is Hu and I'm the Marketing Manager for General Assembly Singapore. I lead marketing for GA in Singapore and very excited to be here to share with you more on this very important topic. And next please. So in case you haven't heard of General Assembly before, we are a global tech education company, and we focus on helping people to reskill and upskill themselves in the most in-demand tech skills. So be it coding, data, of course, being one of them, but we also focus on things like UX design, digital marketing, and product management. So just for some, just some numbers, we are 10 years old this year. This is actually our 10-year anniversary, but we already have more than 30 global campuses worldwide with more than 70,000 course alumni, 500,000 workshop attendees that join us on a weekly basis to pick up skills that they need for their future work, and also more than 20,000 expert instructors like Gwen who join us and who join us in our mission to be able to upskill and reskill the workforce. Yeah, and in particular for GA Singapore, we have been established since mid-2015. We have more than 1,000 immersive, which is our full-time and part-time graduates, more than 5,000 workshop participants and 40,000 community event participants. Locally, we have very strong partnerships with the IMDA, which is our Infocom Media and Development Authority, our employers and the tech community. So in terms of what we offer, that can be kind of neatly categorized into this field that you see over here. So we offer career-changing courses for those who are looking for a very drastic career switch. So for example, you're currently working in the hospitality industry, but you would love to make a switch to become a UX designer or a data scientist, then you can take our 3-month very intensive full-time course to make that switch. You can also join us for part-time courses to just enhance and upskill yourself. Or you can also join us for our community events and workshops. A lot of them are actually led by Wen himself. So if you do join us, you have a great student experience and you also have access to an amazing global alumni network who will be with you every step of the way as you navigate the future work landscape. Yeah, and if you can move to the next slide, please. So I have dropped our contact details over here. I also dropped that in the chat in just a little bit, but if you have any questions about General Assembly, so for example, after this session, if you'd like to take your learning one step further and find out what courses work for you, then you can drop us a note at frontlines.sg@generalassem.ly. I'll drop that in the chat later on, or you can also check out our offerings on our website, but a very shameless plug to please follow us on our social media platforms. So we post about great events like this, like the one that we have, as well as other exciting things happening at GA Singapore. And talking about exciting things, I would just like to share one event series that we have actually ongoing now at this moment. So today is our very first day of the event series that is called Made in Singapore. So if it's not obvious enough, this is to celebrate, of course, Singapore's National Day, but it's really a 2-week-long virtual event series that's for us to celebrate the ones behind Singapore's foremost homegrown brands in different industries. So we have everything from manufacturing to beauty to fashion to tech, startup and investment. So everything that might be of interest to anyone, we probably already have an event in that domain. So if you're keen to find out what's happening in our little red dot, then you can join us and just RSVP for your virtual seat at www.madeinsingapore.ga.com. Yeah, and after this session, if you'd like to take your learning one step further and join one of our remote short workshops, you can use this discount code over here, TRYGA25, to take 25% off all of our paid workshops. And that is all from me. I will not take any more of your time. I will leave you in the good hands of one of our best instructors, Wen, to teach you, how to drive better business decisions with data. Over to you, Wen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hong, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Tuesday to join us in today's session on how to drive better business decisions with data. Right, so my name is Wayne. Perhaps a quick introduction. I'm currently a product analyst with Google, where I work with the product team behind Google's web gaming portal GameSnacks to analyze data from A/B tests to help drive user engagement and retention with our games. Previously, I was working at Unilever, also based in Singapore, where I was with the data science team, working with proprietary transaction level data sets to help drive greater sales effectiveness in Southeast Asia. And on the side, I'm really passionate about cryptocurrency. Sadly, not on the trading front, but more around the technology and how blockchains essentially enable open access to transaction data. So really exciting stuff there, in terms of analytics as well. All right. So by the end of today's session, ideally what you will be able to learn would be to understand what data is currently possible, and how our digital and physical world is now enabling analytics at scale. We'll also be looking at different tools to start capturing, analyzing, and utilizing data in business. And we'll also spend some time talking about machine learning and AI, right? And try to demystify the hype around these buzzwords that we've been hearing about. I'll also be touching on privacy and security measures when working with data. I believe just today, there was news that came out about a data leak from StarHub, right? So it is a very pertinent issue, in recent years. All right. So before we start, as mentioned at the start, if you have any questions, feel free to post it on the Q&A panel, and Hong will help to moderate those questions, and I will, monitor that from time to time. So before we dive into the content proper, let's take a walk down history lane, and get a sense of the history of data, visualized, right? And gain a better understanding of what is
for that intro. And I'm very excited to be here. So I hope everyone is well.
Okay, I think maybe there was a technical hiccup there, but so let's take a walk down, his memory lane or history lane, to get a sense of how we got here. What exactly is this data opportunity? So over here, I have one of the earliest known examples of the use of data in a form of a map. So over here, we see a map of 11th century China. And if you think about it, maps are a form of data, right? Essentially, we are visualizing geospatial data. And over here, we see the first Chinese map to use a grid with each of its 5,000 squares representing one Chinese li, which is approximately 50 kilometers. And the amazing thing is all of this was carved in stone 300 years before the printing press was invented. All right, so over here, we have this detailed map with full grid showing China's coastline as well as the network of rivers with remarkable accuracy. Now, fast forward to the 19th century, over here, we have an early and notable use of data to plot patterns of disease. Now, over here, we have a dot map that was plotted by Dr. John Snow, and he plotted the locations of deaths from cholera in central London in September 1854. Now, the deaths were marked by the dots, as you can see on this visual here, and he also marked the water pumps in crosses, all right, in crosses over here. Now, what Dr. Snow observed was that cholera was occurring almost entirely among those who lived near and drank from the Broad Street water pump, which I've highlighted in the red circle. And using this insight, he had the handle of the water pump removed, thereby ending the epidemic, which by then had taken more than 500 lives. So this was one of the early examples of how data was not only visualized, but how it was used to reveal a root cause to a problem and inspire an actionable solution. Now, over here, we have a classic data representation by Charles Joseph Minard showing the fate of Napoleon's army drawn in 1869. And over here, what's interesting is that it not only combines space, as we saw in the previous two slides, but also a time dimension to the graphic design, thereby allowing it to portray a sequence of devastating losses suffered by Napoleon's campaign in 1812. So how we read this is, starting from the left over here, on the Polish-Russian border, the thick tan flow lines show the size of the Grand Army, which was around 400,000 men at the time, as it invaded Russia in June 1812. Right? The width of the band indicates the army size at each place on the map, and the color represents the direction of the army. And so you can see that as the army marched to Moscow, it suffered heavy losses, and by the time it reached Moscow in September, it had less than 100,000 men remaining. So once they arrived in Moscow, they realized the city was abandoned. And since that suffered heavy casualties, they decided to retreat. And the retreat is depicted by the darker lower band you see here. Now for the retreat, it's also linked to a temperature scale at the bottom, right, with dates at the bottom of the chart. And as the army retreated, winter started to dawn on them, and many of them froze on their march out of Russia. As you can see, crossing the Berezina River was particularly disastrous before the army finally struggled back into Poland with only 10,000 men remaining. So the great thing about this visual is that it allows us to tell a coherent story with multiple variables, right? Not just considering the location, but also direction of movement, temperature, as well as the size of the army. So data has been around since humans have learned to count, right? And we have seen visualizations, since the 11th century. So what's the big deal now, right? Why are people talking about it? Why is IMDA, why is the government talking about analytics? What is this big opportunity? And essentially, this opportunity is driven by greater digitalization of our work and personal lives, right? Enabled by greater adoption of software and the connectivity of the internet. We're now generating more data than ever before. Now, IDC, a market research firm, predicts that the digital universe, or the data that's created and copied every year, will reach 180 zettabytes in 2025. And that's 180 followed by 21 zeros. So massive, massive amounts of data. Now, apart from the quantity of the data, the quality of data has changed as well. We are now collecting more granular data, more granular than before, right? So today we have databases of names and other well-defined personal traits such as age, sex, and income. And we're also collecting vast amounts of unstructured data, such as image data or voice data when you talk to your personal assistants, voice assistants like Siri. Now, the new economy is also about analyzing rapid real-time flows of data. Now, the proliferation of smartphones have resulted in a very established supply chain of components, of small sensors that can now be installed on engines or public transport networks, allowing governments and companies to collect massive floods of data from hundreds of these sensors. So data has become a fundamental component of business value, as can be seen by how many of the mega acquisitions in the past decade have been driven by companies where data was the core of the business. So let me further illustrate the opportunity of data and analytics today. All right, so this brings us to the 21st century. And I talk about how digitalization and how new digital services are enabling new types of data being collected, right? And as a result, this creates new opportunities for data analysis and visualization. Now, over here, we have the map of the United States, right? But it's drawn slightly differently, yeah? For geographical boundaries, typically or traditionally, they were defined by political or natural borders. But over here, what we have is the map of the United States, where its geographical boundaries are defined by user activity on Craigslist, which is a classifieds, American classifieds website. So Craigslist carves up, the US into different sections, with each section representing a territory that's being served by a separate classifieds list. Now, what's interesting is the type of additional information we can overlay on top of that. Now, in every location, Craigslist has a missed connections board where, a lonely heart might post something like, you were wearing a red t-shirt, I was wearing, yellow dress, we boarded bus 8 around noon, right? If you read this, email me. So with that data, you could essentially scrape that data off Craigslist for each locale and essentially overlay that view on this visualization here to identify the most popular venues of longing. Right? So with this, you can see that for most of the US, highlighted in red, a lot of these misconnections tend to happen at Walmart, which is a major supermarket chain. And what's interesting is that on the West Coast, a lot of these misconnections happen in the fitness centers or the gyms. Yeah. Here's another example by Matthew Zook, a geographer in the University of Kentucky. In this project, he partnered data scientists to create what they call the Dolly Project. And this project is essentially a repository of every tweet since December 2011 that includes the latitude and longitude of the user posting it. Now, in February 2012, there was this massive earthquake that occurred in his city. And he turned to this database to see the psychological aftershocks of that earthquake. And what you're seeing here on this map essentially shows the density of reactions on Twitter plotted over the physical epicenter of the fault. And as you can see, the quake's emotional epicenter in red is very close, just northwest of the seismic one. So you can say that such a plot reflects the impact of the earthquake on the community in a more direct way, more so than an old traditional Richter scale. So if you compare the first map of China that was recorded, that we saw in the 11th century, compared to what we've just seen with the Dolly Project, now we're getting to a place where a traditional cartographer can no longer take us, where no satellite can pick up. Right? What I've just described in the previous slide is a new kind of atlas, where we have a behavioral and physical terrain combined as one. And this kind of finding is truly new, right? And as mentioned, the plot on the right, you could say that it reflects, the true impact of the earthquake in a more direct way. And say if your job were to distribute aid to victims, right? This could offer an alternative perspective and a more powerful, impactful perspective on the best way to distribute that aid. So this is the big data opportunity that we have today. And as a result, data strategy is becoming more and more important as part of your business strategy. So, I've talked about history and the context of data, and we have seen and had a better understanding of what is the big data opportunity. So, how should we think about data in business? Now, one way to think about data would be by thinking about the life cycle of data, starting from the collection of the data all the way to the processing of it, preparation of it, eventually to the analysis and the use of the data to generate insights. And this could be done by a human or could be done by a machine through the application of machine learning algorithms. So what we have here is a pyramid that highlights the, you could say the data science hierarchy of needs, right? And at the bottom, we start from the bottom. This is where we look at data collection, right? And of data that we've collected, we need to think about where we want to store it, right? And more importantly, beyond just storing it, it's also about how to make the data accessible to other people in your organization. Now, after thinking about where to store the data, the next step would be to think about how to clean the data and how to process the data. So I'll talk about, the characteristics of clean data in a few slides later on. And after we have cleaned the data, then the next step would be to run the analysis. All right, so this would encompass the last three steps here. And this would involve, applying different analytical frameworks, such as a cohort analysis or correlation analysis, which I'll touch on later, or applying some machine learning algorithm, using the data to train the model, and then using the final model, the trained model, to help predict future unseen cases. All right, so that's one way to think about, data in business. Right, so I'll cover each step in the following slides. So let's start by looking at data collection. Now, with data, you can collect data anywhere, right? There are a lot of different places where you can collect data. So, when we think about collecting data in business, what's the best way to think about collecting data? Right? Where do we start? when we want to collect data. So one way to frame data collection would be to apply what's known as the R framework, right? And the R actually stands for something. So this R framework was developed by Dave McClure, who is a venture capitalist and angel investor and founder of the startup accelerator 500 Startups. So essentially with the R framework, it helps you identify the 5 most important classes of metrics for a company by understanding the customer and the customer journey, right? Because with each step of the customer journey, they are indirectly driving business growth. So the core idea is that with this framework, you can identify the key bottlenecks at each stage of the consumer journey. And once you identify those bottlenecks, you can go in there, fix the issue, and ideally continue to drive and optimize for business growth. So over here, we have this framework essentially mapping out the consumer journey on a very high level. And the first stage is acquisition, right? So essentially, how do users find you? Is it through word of mouth, TV ads, search ads? And of course, marketing would play a big role. Now, for those of y'all who have taken classes in marketing, you're probably aware of the marketing funnel, right? So you can actually decompose this even further by looking at your marketing funnel around awareness. How do you raise awareness, increase consideration, and how do you convert, right? So all of that can be part of the acquisitions stage over here. Now, the next step of the consumer journey is the activation. So the activation is all about the first experience that your customer has with the product. And because it's the first experience, that's why it's crucial to get your user to the aha moment, as fast as you can, right? So this is the first time the user realizes the real value from your product. Now, the next stage would be retention, right? So do people regularly come back to use your product? Now, if a lot of people are dropping off your product after they start using it, then clearly something must be wrong, right? Either with your product or with your messaging, right? Maybe you're setting wrong expectations. So the key goal here is you want to make sure that your customer churn rate is lower than your customer acquisition rate. Now, the fourth stage over here would be revenue. And essentially, that's about how do you make money. So the key concept here would be essentially to increase your customer lifetime value, right? And I'll talk about that, shortly, using a cohort analysis. The goal is to increase the customer lifetime value and to decrease the costs that it takes to acquire them. And that brings us to the last step, which is referral, right? So the best way to drive business growth is through referrals, right? So you can either incentivize folks to refer their friends, like what Dropbox used to do. And one key metric you can keep an eye on when it comes to referrals would be your Net Promoter Score, or NPS, which is an index that ranges from -100 to 100 and measures how willing customers are willing to recommend your company's products or services. Yeah. All right, so we looked at the different stages of the consumer journey, right? And we talked about how these are some areas where you could start to collect data. Now, I do want to also mention that when you collect data, there are also 2 broad types of data. You can have quantitative data, or you can have qualitative data. And I want to highlight that it is important to collect both, because one can guide the other to help you gain a better picture of your business. Now, in recent years, data-driven decision-making has been the hot thing, right? Everyone wants to have data and use data to implement, to sort of instill some discipline in decision-making. But I do want to caution folks that it's not always about the quantitative data, right? The qualitative, unmeasurable data is also equally important. And I love this quote by William Bruce Cameron, and it goes, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted," right? So just because you don't have the data set, which is very common, by the way, you may not always have the data. Just because you don't have the data, does not mean that it is a factor or a consideration that you should not bear in mind. So I talked about how it's important to collect both quantitative and qualitative data, right? So one question you might have is, which should you start to collect first? So you can start with both, right? You can start by collecting the quantitative data, right? And in this case, one example would be to observe that, say, 50% of customers tend to drop off at the checkout page, right? So quantitative data is a great way to observe behavior. But if you want to understand what drives the behavior or why people do certain things, then it's really important to understand the attitudes of people by collecting the qualitative data. So in this case, you might want to ask questions to understand why customers are dropping out at the checkout page. Right? So you can do these through interviews or open-ended questions, for example. Now, another approach could be to start with the qualitative data as a way to understand the business context or hypotheses, right? So you might ask someone who is more experienced in the business, or you might even interview customers and ask them, right, how they feel about the business. So for example, people might tell you that I love eating sushi on Fridays. And with that, now you now have an initial hypothesis that you can validate or invalidate by using quantitative data, right? So for example, now you can then, if you know that people love eating sushi on Fridays, then now you can go back and dig into the transaction, the sales data, and to validate if that is true or not. And if it's true, to what extent, right? And you can go on and build on it by coming up with new hypotheses to ultimately drive towards the business goals. So as mentioned, it's important to collect both quantitative and qualitative data. Now, in terms of the practicalities of it, as a data analyst or as someone who is seeking to use data in business, it is generally better to start with the qualitative approach, right? And usually you might have a sense of what problem to solve when you talk to customers, or if you're, in a broader organization, your manager who has more experience might have better contextual knowledge on the core problems to solve for, right? So it could be helpful to start with the qualitative approach and understand the hypotheses or the business questions that you want answered, right? And when you have these initial hypotheses, that can help to scope your work so that you don't end up boiling the ocean, because there is an infinite number of analyses you could do, right? So, having the initial hypothesis can help to scope your work and anchor analysis so that you do not go crazy, right, by analyzing every single thing. However, you might be in a situation whereby your manager doesn't even know how to begin, right? Or maybe your business is in a new space, right? So maybe then you might want to do some exploratory data analysis by starting with the quantitative approach, right? So if you have a data set, you can slice and dice it and explore it, right? Plot charts, understand trends, understand market share, and through this process, you might have some questions, right? There might be some interesting insights that pop up that can help you form your hypotheses. All right. Cool. So perhaps let's take a moment to think about what are key metrics that are important to your current role or function, right? I noticed that the chat box is somewhat quiet. Feel free to post your comments in the chat box, or if you have any questions, feel free to post at any time. And I will try to answer it immediately so that folks have that full context, right? So let's spend a moment to think about key metrics that are important to your current role or function, right? And again, one thing to think about this is how your role sits within the R framework, right? Which part of the consumer journey are you, serving customers at? We do also consider how the metrics can measure progress, right? And more importantly, how the metrics can be actionable. Yeah. So let's spend a few moments on that. All right. So, while folks think about that, do keep your questions coming. All right. And of course, feel free to post your comments in the chat box, especially those working in a variety of industries. I think one of the reasons why I love teaching at General Assembly is I get the chance to meet folks from different industries. And, I believe that's what students that sign up for General Assembly enjoy as well, right? It's a great way to to network across industries as well. Yeah. All right, so I see a couple of questions, so maybe a quick one. So there's a question, is there a marketplace to buy data? Now, I would say that it really depends on the industry, yeah, and the type of data that you are looking for. You know, today there is a general movement towards open source data. Some of you might have seen the data.gov site, not only by the Singapore government, but also in the UK and the US as well, right? So, there are instances whereby organizations are open sourcing the data and it's free and accessible, right? Some of the data, you can purchase it, right? And really depends on the industry. For example, Nielsen is a big player in the consumer goods industry, and they sell data, like aggregated transaction data of different products, aggregating it from supermarket sales, for example, right? So it really depends on the industry, and you can identify these vendors that can possibly sell you the data that you need. And I'll talk about data strategy towards the end. Yeah. Right. Okay, so any comments on metrics? All right, so I think to also build on the earlier question, Jardine asked, what are some good places to refer to industry type of data besides paid options? So, just to add on to that, I think that's where the interesting stuff happens, right? Because if you want to use data in business in a competitive way, then you need to think about how the data that you're collecting is proprietary, right? Or put in other words, data that no one else can acquire, right? So typically, your big tech companies, Google, Facebook, they are the ones that are collecting data by themselves, right? So it's their proprietary data that they're collecting through their products. Apart from the collection of data, you can also think about how to extract the insights from your data, right? So with one data set, different people can look at it in different ways, right? So, I would say that that's where a bit of the creativity comes in. And, of course, it really depends on the industry as well. Yeah. All right. So yeah, there was a question on open data sets from Kaggle. That's a great place as well. So Kaggle is a place where people have data competitions. So, clients can, they also do upload data, although some of them might be anonymized. So it may or may not be as helpful. Yeah, and of course, yes, you're right. Web scraping, right? Writing programs, Python programs to essentially copy and paste data from different websites. Yeah. So, there are different considerations, right? Kaggle is probably anonymous. Web scraping, it can be tedious because if your website changes, it breaks, and you might be violating some policies from websites. So it really depends on the different options that you have, and of course depends on your business as well, right? What kind of data would be helpful for your business? Okay. So Jen asked, how do I decide how many % of qualitative or quantitative data to collect? So there is no hard and fast rule. And it's really very subjective, right? Because qualitative data in itself is subjective. So later on in this session, I'm going to talk about, how to make use of data, from an individual standpoint, right? Starting with the business question and, before doing the analysis. So I wouldn't worry too much about that percentage, right? I think ultimately it's about understanding the business question, right? What is the goal? What is the objective? Understanding the context, right? Why are people, buying your product? Why are people not buying your product? And then going into the data to do your quantitative analysis. So there isn't really a hard and fast rule on the percentage of qualitative versus quantitative, right? Okay, so question on cleaning, I'll talk about that later on. All right, so you do keep these questions coming. I'm gonna, if they're good questions, I'm gonna try to answer them because I think that's sort of the biggest value add with these sessions, right? To have your questions answered live. So keep them coming, and I'll try to prioritize them and focus on answering those questions. All right. Okay, but yeah, I see Pramila. Thank you for going through the exercise. So for nonprofits, how metrics are being applied for beneficiaries. Yes, so that how the metrics are Yes, so you could look at benefit metrics, centered around beneficiaries. So then it depends on what specific nonprofit work that the organization is doing, right? So for example, just top of my head, if you're distributing food, then it could be, how much food was distributed, right? It could be what percentage of a residential estate were you able to reach, right? It could be, satisfaction. Maybe you could do a survey, right? Have people heard about the work that you have been doing, right? Do people benefit from the food that's being given out? I read somewhere that people did not find as much use for canned goods, right? For example. So these are some possible data points that you can collect. Yeah. Now, if you come to think of any metrics, here are some ideas to help kickstart that process, right? And as alluded to in some of my answers, it really depends on your industry and your company, right? So for general business, some data points would be around number of sales, revenue. And if you're dealing with e-commerce specifically, right, then some metrics that are specific to e-commerce would be orders, average order value, or the checkout abandonment, for example, right? If you're looking at mobile apps, if let's say you're building a mobile app, right, some metrics would be downloads, how many people are downloading your app, daily, monthly active users, that is a key metric as well, or ratings, right, when people give their reviews on the App Store. Now, as mentioned at the start, right, around the big data opportunity, a lot of it is driven by digitalization. And if your product or your business is centered around a digital product, then there's a lot more data there's a lot more data you can collect, or a lot more granular data that you can collect, right? And that's because with software, with code, you can essentially abstract anything, right, and collect as granular of data as you want. So for example, with mobile apps, we talked about tracking downloads, right, or ratings. But you can also write your code in a way that fires events and collects data around the number of apps, number of times it was opened, for example, or number of times the app crashed. It can even track, how many times a link was clicked within the app, right? So with software products, you can collect even more granular data depending on your needs. Now, when we look at metrics that measure how people feel, we have CSAT, which is a common score. It's what we use at Google to measure satisfaction, customer effort score, and net promoter score, which I covered earlier. So these are some metrics that can help to measure how people feel about your product or service. And over here, I have an overview of different data collection tools, right? So some of them are free, some of them have a free trial. For example, Google Analytics, it's free. You can install it on your website and it tracks, it essentially helps you track engagement with your website, right? So you can see how people are engaging with your blog or your e-commerce site, for example. Salesforce is also another popular one, and that helps you track how your sales teams are engaging with clients, right? And have this centralized place to build and develop your relationship with clients. All right, so now that we've covered data collection, the next step is moving and storage. All right. So, and as mentioned, it's not just about, finding a place to store data. It's not just finding, hard drive storage, either next on a hard disk or in a database, right? But storage of data is also about how to easily access and analyze that data, right? So, because you can have this expensive infrastructure that stores the data, but if no one else in your organization knows about it, then it's not as valuable, right? And you're not able to unlock value from that data. So let's get a bit technical when it comes to moving and storage, right? And I'm just going to talk through this in a very high level way because I know that this session is an introductory session. And when it comes to databases, there is an entire different career path for folks who are interested in the technicals, right? So you have your data engineers and you have people who work to build up data infrastructure in companies, right? So this is barely scratching the surface, right? But when we talk about storage of data, essentially we're talking about databases, right? So I'm sure folks have heard about databases, and essentially it's a way to store structured data on a computer, right? That it's easily accessible for future use, right? Now, what you may not have heard of, or you have heard less often, would be the data warehouse. So a data warehouse is structured to specifically make analytics fast and easy, right? And for a data warehouse, it typically exists as a layer on top of another database or databases, right? So again, if it's about querying the data, running analytics on top of it, then a data warehouse would be appropriate. Now, a last technical setup is what's known as a data lake, which is, you probably have heard this as well as a buzzword. So essentially, a data lake is a storage repository that holds a huge amount of raw data in its original format, right? So for a database and data warehouse, typically we're looking at structured tables, right? Process structured tables. But with a data lake, you can store basically any type of raw data, right? Be it image files or voice data, right? Audio data, all of that can be stored in a data lake with its raw form, right? And the popularity of data lakes are driven by how now we have machine learning algorithms that can process image and voice data, right? So typically we want to store all of this data in a data lake before it is used by data scientists, in applying these different machine learning algorithms. And if you are working in an organization, these are some considerations to bear in mind if you're thinking about, setting up a database or a data warehouse. And I think important points would be the scale, right? How much data do you plan to store? For many businesses, if you're not collecting massive amounts of data, sometimes a spreadsheet could work, right? If you think about Excel, Google Sheets, these are tools to also analyze data and store data, right? And these are as effective, tools, right? It's just that if you're able to collect a lot of data or have access to huge repository of data, then the scale is different, right? But ultimately, the fundamentals are very similar. Right? Okay, cool. So now that we have found a place to store the data, right, the next step would be to explore and to transform that data set. Now, as mentioned, when you're collecting data, especially if you're collecting data through non-digital channels, there is a possibility of collecting data that is not of good quality, right? You might be collecting data that's what's known as dirty data. And these are some dimensions of data quality, which I will talk through in a bit. But essentially, this is a step whereby we need to take steps to prepare the data for analysis. And this is an important step, a critical step, because the common saying is that rubbish in, rubbish out, right? If you have dirty data or wrong data, no matter how robust your analysis is, the insights will not be meaningful, right? So this is a critical step to help prepare your data for analysis. All right. So what do we mean by clean data? Right. Now over here we have 5 dimensions of data quality. Right. So the first dimension is validity. Right. Essentially, does your data follow defined business rules or constraints? Right. And now one example would be, say, sales. Right. Is it possible for your data to contain negative sales? Now, at first glance, you might think, okay, that's not possible. How can you have negative sales? But what if your company allows for refunds? What if your company allows customers to return products and get a refund? And for every refund, it would be recorded as a negative sale, right? Now, if that is the case, then yes, negative sales is possible, right? You can have negative sales in your data set. All right, so this is what it means by the validity of the data, depending on your business rules. Now, the next dimension is accuracy, right? So essentially, how close to reality is the data? Now, how I like to think about data and insights is to use an analogy of a map, right? Now we have a map, and a map is a visual representation of the terrain, and the physical terrain. And a map helps us get from one point to another, right? And it helps us not get lost. But ultimately, the map is not reality, right? The map is a best guess representation of the underlying terrain. And it can be wrong, right? Data can be wrong. And I think it's always important to remember that just because you have your data doesn't mean it is right. It does not mean that it is fully accurate, right? Because data is just a representation of something, a physical, something, underlying. Yeah, so it's important to consider how accurate your data is. Now, a third dimension would be the completeness of your data. Are there values missing? And missing data is known as null values, NULL, and I have a couple of slides on that. And with null values or missing values, it's important to note that it is different from zero, the number zero, right? Null values just mean that there is nothing. We're missing data, right? So the difference between zero and null is this, right? Let's say you have a sales team, and this particular salesperson brought in 0 sales, as opposed to null sales or blank sales or missing sales, right? Now, in the first case, if you have 0 sales, that's bad, right? Because it means that the person did not work hard enough to get in sales. But if you have missing data or a null value, it just means that you don't know, right? So then the next step would be to try and get the data. All right, so there is a difference between 0 and null values, and it's important to identify where your values are missing and to handle them. Okay, so I have a couple of slides on that in a bit. Now, the third dimension is consistency of the data, right? And this is particularly important if your organization is storing data in different locations or different silos. So one example would be number of employees, right? Let's say each department has its own record of the number of employees. So when you sum up the employees in each department of the company, you need to check to make sure that it does not exceed the total number of employees in that organization, right? So this is what it means by the consistency of the data across different data stores. And this is naturally especially important when you are combining data sets from 2 different systems. Yeah. And the last dimension is the uniformity, right? Our standard units of measurement being used, right? So common standards of measurement could be, say, currency, US dollars, Singapore dollars. Is that consistent throughout the entire data set? Right, so these are 5 dimensions of data quality, and it really depends on how data is collected, right? So if your data is being collected through digital ways or through sensors, then there is less room for human error, right? Another consideration is whether or not you have another team in your organization that is helping to process it or to clean the data before you can use it, right? Or it could be another vendor that does it for you, right? So Nielsen also aggregates the data, and they make sure that the data is complete before selling the data to organizations. Yeah. So in more tangible ways, right? Let's say as an individual, you want to process and clean data, right? So some common data cleaning actions could be, say, reformatting dates, right? To make sure that Excel recognizes them correctly. You might want to extract the month or the year from a date, right? If you have a separate column that extracts the month or year, then this allows you to do deeper analysis, right? To sum up sales for a year, for example, and allow you to calculate the annual trend. You might want to remove duplicate rows. You might want to combine data sets together, and you might want to handle missing values. All right. So as mentioned, null values are missing values, and it is not 0. Okay, it is not the word null. It's just empty, right? It's missing values. So you might want to consider handling missing values, right? For example, some machine learning algorithms, cannot take in null values. So you need to impute those missing values or handle them, right? So over here, we have 4 ways you can handle missing values. You can either find the missing value, right? You could ignore them, right? If you're not using those algorithms, you could ignore them. you could impute them, right? So if there's a missing value, you can say, okay, let's just take the average of the entire column and impute it, right? Use it as the value. Or you can just delete the entire row, right, in the data set. Okay. All right, so Randy was talking, but Randy had a question, is the cleaning and preparation of data an automatic process or manual? So two dimensions to this question, all right? So it depends on the tool that you are using. So if you're using Excel, it's a point and click tool. And unless you're using VBA macros, it's a manual process, right? You need to apply filters and explore the data and make sure that you manually clean it. If you are using macros, VBA macros, or if you're using SQL, then you can write code that can essentially automate it, right? So let's say you write some code to clean it, and the next week you have a new data set. Same format, same structure, but dirty, right? So then you can just run the code and that can automatically process it, right? Now, the other dimension is actually building the code itself, right? So whenever you're building that code, it has to be a manual process, right? Because you need to understand, what are the inconsistencies and what are the different dimensions of cleanliness that's not being fulfilled. Yeah. But a big part of data and data workflows is the building of these pipelines that can help to automate the cleaning and preparation of data. Especially if the data is of the same structure and you have new data coming in that's always as dirty. Yeah. Right. So one question around cleanliness is how to know how clean your data is? Is there any software tool to measure data cleanliness? Good question. So there is no universal metric, right? Because it really depends on the organization, right? For example, in your particular use case, missing values may not be important, right? So that may not be an important consideration. There are some, if you know a bit of Python, there are some Python code that you can run that can, essentially summarize the data for you, right? So for example, it can tell you how many missing values there are, for you to then decide what to do with it. Yeah. Other examples would be, it would give you the sum or the average, and you can take, a quick look to see if it makes sense. But ultimately, there needs to be a human that makes the judgment as to whether or not the data is clean. Yeah. So I see a question from Renson on, is it normally a shared responsibility to ensure data quality, or is it passed on to the data scientists? So it really depends. It really depends, because I know data scientists who also, spend time doing data cleaning, right? The common joke is that data scientists spend 70% of their time cleaning data and then spend 30% of the time complaining about data cleaning, right? So even data scientists, do spend a chunk of their time preparing the data, right? And the actual running of the algorithms, that is, comparatively, short amount of time needed, right? So it really depends on the scope of the data scientists and whether or not there are dedicated teams that can help with that, right? All right, great. Okay, so with that, we come to the last stage of the data lifecycle, which is analytics. And this is the fun part, the sexy part, whereby now we are applying different frameworks or applying different machine learning algorithms. But before we dive into it, perhaps let's take a 5-minute break. Right? I know that it can be a bit tiring sometimes to sit through a Zoom session. So let's take a 5-minute break, get some water, get a drink, and I'll see everyone back here in 5 minutes. All right. Thank you, everybody. Alrighty, welcome back from the break, everybody. I hope everyone is refreshed. All right, give me a moment while I present again. Okay, so before the break, we looked at how data can be used in business by essentially looking at the life cycle of data, right? So we looked at how we can collect data, and we looked at storage options, and we looked at the importance of preparing and cleaning the data before use. Now we move on to the last stage, which is the analytics, right? So this is the fun, sexy part that people talk about, right? And this can include, a human, right, doing the analysis, by him or herself, right? It could span from building very simple pivot tables for those of you all who are familiar with Excel, or creating visualizations or charts to identify trends. Now, more advanced approaches could be to apply what's known as A/B testing, right? So, if you have a digital product, you can segment your users into 2 experiment groups, 1 control, 1 treatment group, and you can track their behavior and see how they engage with your product or engage with variants of your product to help improve how you build the product or service. And you can also apply machine learning to essentially have the machine decide for you, right? So, this would be typically centered around operational users, right? So, for example, you can have machine learning that predicts what product a user might be interested in buying, depending on what products the user has seen before or bought before, right? Or it could be a machine learning service to identify good sales leads, right? Based on your historical sales and based on the customers that you have acquired previously. So, with these machine learning algorithms, essentially it comprises of 2 phases. One is the training phase, right? You need to train the model. And the way to train the model is to feed the algorithm with a lot of data, right? A lot of historical data. Now, once the model has been trained, essentially it is a representation of those patterns that it has observed from the data. Now it can be used to predict sort of the new cases or the unseen cases, right? So I have a slide on machine learning, and I will be spending some time talking about that in a bit. Okay, so let's start with the human component, right, of analytics. Now, I talked about how, as an individual, how you can essentially make, how you typically use data when making business decisions or running data analysis, right? So this is another way to think about using data in business, right? Previously, when I showed you the pyramid, it talks about data, the life cycle of the data. Now, I'm sort of looking at it from the human's perspective, right? How you make use of data in business. And there are some overlaps and some parallels, which I'll talk about in a bit. So in terms of how a human or data analyst can make use of data in business, over here I have what's known as the data analyst workflow, right? And it comprises of 6 steps. Now, the first step is framing your business question or framing your business hypothesis that you would then go on to validate or invalidate, right? So this is very similar to what I talked about earlier when it comes to qualitative data, right? Understanding the business question to help scope your analysis. Now, the next step would be to extract and acquire the data that you need, right? So as an individual data analyst, you might need to get the data or query the data from a database, right? So if your organization has a database set up, then you just need to go to the right team and request for access to the data, all right? And write some code, write some SQL query, or use some interface to download the data that you need. All right, so that's the extraction stage, right? So I hope folks can start to see that parallels with that data lifecycle that I shared earlier. Then the next step would be to prepare the data, right? So again, it goes back to the concept of data cleanliness, right? Now, if there is another team in your organization that has already cleaned the data for you, then this might not be as important, right? So then consider yourself lucky that you don't have to do that tedious work before going on to analyze that data, right? But of course, if the data is not clean, then you might have to do some cleaning yourself, right? So this step is critical. Now, once you have the clean data, then the next two steps would be around analyzing it, interpreting the insights. And this is where a lot of the brain work comes in before communicating those insights to your stakeholders, right? So if you have senior stakeholders, you're a manager, this is where you would present your insights to them as a result of your analysis. Now, the key thing I want to highlight is that it's not just about presenting your insights, but also the recommendations or the action steps that you want your audience to take, given those insights, right? Because, it's always going to be interesting. The insights are always going to be interesting, right? But at the end of the day, we have limited time, we have limited resources, and, your stakeholder just wants to know what action he or she needs to take, given that insight. And it's also important for yourself as a data analyst to present the action steps and to get folks to take action on your data, right? Because at the end of the day, your work will be sort of assessed by the impact that you make on the business. And as an analyst, it's very difficult to quantify the impact unless you encourage or influence your stakeholders to take action from your data insights. So highlighting not just the insights, but also the actionable recommendations, that is absolutely critical. Now, one reason why this workflow is arranged in this circular manner is because this process is and should be taken or should be adopted in an iterative way, right? So for example, as you analyze your data, you might find some interesting tidbits or interesting insights that fundamentally change how you see the problem, right? So if that happens, then you might want to go back to the drawing board and reframe it and come up with a new hypothesis. All right. So this is again very related to what I shared earlier about adopting both the quantitative and qualitative approach, right? So as you do your qualitative analysis, that might change your business question, and it would be important for you to go back, reframe it, extract the right data sets you need before doing the analysis again. Right. You might also want to communicate to your stakeholders regularly, right, to get feedback early on, just to make sure that you're on the right track, right? Because the worst thing that can happen to you is you spend 1 month doing the analysis and do your presentation, and turns out that is not what your stakeholder wanted at all. So you've just wasted 1 month, right? So it's typically good practice to adopt an iterative process, right? Share some initial insights with your stakeholder, get the feedback, and redo your analysis if needed, double down on the analysis, or you might even reframe your business question. All right, so take it as an iterative a workflow rather than a linear one. Okay. So when you are doing the analysis, it's important to understand the goals of your business. All right. And, it's not just for individual analysts, but it's also for, say, managers or founders of businesses, right? If you want to incorporate data in your business or data in your decision-making, it's important to take a step back and, understand the goals, right? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this in the first place? And this framework here can be helpful, right? Over here, we have these overlapping circles where we have the largest circle or the outer perimeter really encompassing the business vision, right? Why does this business exist in the first place, right? Now, a step down would be the business goals, right? So what are the tangible goals that you have set or the organization has set to help you achieve that vision? The next step down would be the specific business initiatives, right? Or the programs that are being run, right? To try and hit those goals, right? So for example, if the goal is to make money, which is a very common goal, right? Then you would have different business initiatives to make money, right? You could be selling subscriptions, you could be selling products. So these are the different initiatives. And of course, ultimately, what you're doing is you're providing a core product or core service to your customers. So before you start your analysis, before you start diving into the data, always ask yourself, why are we doing this? What is the goal, the key objective or the core objective? All right. Now, I was attending this talk, at Google, from someone who is a very senior person, and he was sharing some advice, and I thought it was really interesting. He started out as an analyst, and he was sharing about how when he was younger, he would love to listen to the quarterly shareholder earnings calls, right? So for public companies, every quarter, the company would present its financial results to bankers and investors, and investors will get the chance to ask the CEO questions, right, or ask the board or the executives questions about the business, right? And he would take special effort to dial into those calls, right? Those calls are public, they're open, as a public company, and he would look out for the pertinent questions that these financial analysts would ask, right? Because these are really smart people, right? These financial analysts working in banks, they manage billions of dollars, and they will ask really sharp questions. And he saw it as a way to really understand, what were the pertinent issues, what were the key issues, and depending on the answer, from the CEO, you could get a sense of the long-term direction of the company, right, through these answers. And the reason why he does that is because it gives you a sense of where the company is going and how that might impact your work down the line, right? Because at the end of the day, one day down the line, it will trickle down to your core work, right? From a day-to-day basis, it can be very difficult to get the big picture view and see how your work ties into the broader organization, right? But through those calls, he gets a sense of what the business goals are and the general direction of the business, right? And it helps to orientate, his thinking, and helps him connect the dots, and of course, makes his work more relevant as well, right? Once you are able to understand the long-term business goals. All right. So understanding the business goals, that is absolutely critical. Now, when we think about goals, we also want to think about how we measure progress towards those goals, right? And the different metrics you can use. Now, I do want to highlight that there are two main types of metrics. You have your top-level metrics, and these are metrics that provide top-level indicators of behavior, but it does not provide the full story of your product, right? So these could be metrics like page views, visits, number of searches. The second class of metrics would be your business metrics. And these are metrics that tie directly to your core business goals and results. So examples of some business metrics would be, say, number of sales or revenue or profit, right? For a company that, whose goal is to make money, right? So revenue, profit, these are the fundamental business metrics that are very important, right? I would say that both metrics are, needed, right? The top level metrics can give you an indicator of behavior, how customers are engaging with your product or your service, which can then impact your revenue or profits down the line, right? But the thing to remember is that sometimes these top level metrics, with these top level metrics, there's a risk of focusing on them and forgetting the important business metrics that tie directly to your business goals, right? So some of these top level metrics might be called vanity metrics, right? Because if you're running an e-commerce website, if you have 10 million page views, that's really impressive, right? But if none of those customers are buying anything, then you're not going to drive towards your business goals of generating revenue, right? So there is a risk of being too focused on these vanity metrics and not focused on the core business metrics. All right, so really important to be mindful of what kind of metrics you're measuring. All right, so when we talk about the analysis, right? So, not only does it encompass the framing piece, but also the interpretation and analysis piece, right? So assuming you have extracted your data, you have obtained the data that you need, assuming you have already cleaned it, then the fun part is around analyzing it and interpreting it for insights. All right. So now, as a human that is doing this analysis, all right, there are different ways you can analyze data, right? You can slice and dice your data in different ways. right? A common, framework would be to just add up values, right? To calculate aggregates, sum of sales across the years, or sum of sales across different categories, right? You can use pivot tables. If you're familiar with Excel, you can use pivot tables for that. But in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about a few other analytical frameworks that could be helpful depending on your industry or depending on your company. All right. So what we have over here on this slide is known as a funnel analysis. And this is especially useful for, it's useful for actually many businesses and many products and services where you have that consumer journey and where you're tracking each stage of the consumer journey. So this is very, very similar to what I shared earlier about the R framework, right? Again, very centered on the customer journey, but this time we are more tactical, right? In this case, we are measuring very specific metrics around how the user engages with your product. Okay, so in this case, I have the example I've shown here is, say, for example, an e-commerce website, but it can be applied to any business or service, right? Because essentially it looks at each stage of the consumer journey. All right, so this is to answer the question around applying the R framework, right? So this is a more tangible way to do it. So let's say you are running an e-commerce site, and naturally you would expect people to come to your website, view products, customize, do some customizations before adding to a cart, checking out, and before paying for the service. All right. So of course, it really depends on how you map it out and depends on your business, right? And how this funnel analysis works is that it assumes, rightly so, that let's say you have 100 people that come to your website. Naturally, it's normal to observe that, say, 80 of them would go on to view your product. And of those 80, maybe only 50 become interested in customizing it, right? So it's very normal to have people drop off at each stage of the funnel, right? The key approach is to identify what these stages are and to track the specific actions that customers are expected to take at each stage of the funnel. Right, so in this case, we just so happen to define it as product views, customizations, additions, checkouts, and purchases. Now, with each interaction, right, assuming assuming you have your trackers that are built in place, you can track how many customers progress from one stage of the funnel to the next, and you can essentially calculate a percentage of people that move on. Right, so of, let's say, 100 people that visit the website, 80 of them view products, then you can say that you can calculate that as 80%, sort of a movement of 80%, right? And of those that view products, let's say 40 of them move on to customize their product, then 40 out of 80 is 50%, right? So you can calculate these rates at which your users progress down the funnel. Now, the fun part is once you have this in place, then with each of those percentage metrics that I have just shared, you can essentially identify what are the key bottlenecks. All right. So perhaps once you do the analysis, you might realize that, whoa, we have only 1% of users that add items to the cart. Right. That means 99% of folks from the previous stage drop off. Now, then you need to ask yourself, is that normal? Right? So you can either compare it with the industry benchmark, or you can, analyze the trend over time, right? Maybe the number has been dropping over the months, right? So this is a way to identify and pinpoint the stage of the consumer journey that can be further optimized, right? So once you identify that cart additions is the bottleneck, then you can investigate further, right? So you can either collect more data around the cart, collect more data around the average size of the order. You can do qualitative research, talk to people who have dropped off, and understand why they are no longer adding products to the cart. So, through this process, you might realize that, oh, okay, maybe people are not adding products to the cart because maybe on some websites, the button is no longer working. All right. Through your analysis, you might realize that, okay, the button is no longer working. That is the root cause, right? So you go in there, you have your team fix it, and now people are able to add items to the cart, and you would see the percentage of users that add items to the cart increased to 50%. Right? So that helps to address the bottleneck. And now that you have more people adding products to the cart, naturally, you're going to have more people in absolute terms checking out and purchasing, even if the percentage of folks moving from the funnel is the same, right? Because same percentage of a larger number means you have larger number from an absolute standpoint, right? So this is how we can apply the funnel analysis to identify bottlenecks in the consumer journey and fix it, right? So and then of course over time you can track it, make sure that you don't see drastic drops as people progress, as your customers progress from each stage to the next. Yeah. All right. Another analytical framework is known as cohort analysis. And cohort analysis is typically used and applied for businesses that have a recurring subscription revenue, right? For example, Netflix. Every month you're paying X dollars. But even if you don't have a subscription business, right? Let's say a business whereby people purchase your product in a regular fashion, or is expected to purchase your product in a regular fashion, right? You can also use a cohort analysis. So essentially with a cohort analysis, what you're doing is you are able to understand the retention or the value of your customers throughout their entire life cycle, right? And in addition to that, you can track different cohorts of customers and see how the introduction of a new service or introduction of a new product has changed your customer behavior or changed your customer life cycle. All right. So how we do this is, let me just zoom in a little, right, to make it easier for folks to see. All right, so say we have this cohort analysis view. All right. Now, each row represents a cohort of customers that have signed up to your business. All right. Now, in this case, what we have is we are tracking these users that have signed up on the week of April 27th, and there's 79 users, right? So of this group of users, what we then do is subsequently we track their behavior over the subsequent weeks, right? Now, in this case, what we are tracking is the retention rate, right? So in the next week, how many percent of the original 79 do come back to the website? All right, so on and so forth, right? So with each subsequent week, you can see what is the percentage of users coming back. And naturally, at some point, right, because people do lose interest, you would expect that maybe in 17 weeks, you would have very few people that come back. And that's why you see it turn red, right? Because you have a very low retention by the 17th week, which could be normal, right? Because people lose interest. Okay. So with this view, you can see if there is a particular week where users tend to drop off, right? For example, week number 9, the retention rate is particularly low at 11%. And if you observe that, then you might want to decide to do something to help retain the user, right? So maybe on week 9, you send an email newsletter to attract the user back. All right. So again, a cohort analysis essentially allows you to track key metrics such as retention over the entire life cycle of the customer. All right. Now, the other part of it is to track across cohorts, right? So we talked about how we track the 79 users that signed up in a given week. Now, in the next week, you're going to have new customers that sign up, right? So now you can establish a new cohort. In this case, May 4th, you have a new cohort of 168 users. And for that cohort, now you want to track what is the retention in subsequent weeks. Right? So we do the same thing, but for the next set of users that have signed up for your service. All right. So naturally, as you can see on the second row, it's going to be shorter than your first row, right? Because they signed up in the next week. So you're going to have less data, all right? But essentially, you can do the same thing for that particular cohort, all right? Now, and of course, you can do this for subsequent cohorts, right? So for later users that sign up, you can do that same tracking. Now, the reason why we do this is because we want to see if there are common patterns of behavior, right? Just now we saw that, okay, for week 9, we saw a drop in retention, but if you look at subsequent cohorts, that's not really the case, right? So maybe it was a one-off occurrence. You notice that in week 6, you see particularly high number of users returning, right? So, this could say something about user behavior, right? Because this pattern is being observed in all cohorts, right? You can also track the effectiveness and impact of different programs, right? So, just now we talked about how in week 9, the first cohort saw a drop in retention. So maybe, after you implemented this new process whereby on week 9, you're sending that email, right? In subsequent cohorts, if you're doing that same thing, then you would expect the retention rates to not drop to the level seen in the first cohort, right? Which is what we're seeing here. Okay, so this could be the case, right? Week 9, you see the improvement in the retention, and that could be because we have implemented some process, right? That's resulting in better metrics for subsequent cohorts. Yeah, so this is a really useful tool to isolate cohorts, track them across the life cycle, and measure the impact of different programs to help improve these metrics. Now, what I've just talked about, we looked at retention rates as a metric, right? But you could also measure other things. For example, say the revenue that's generated for each cohort, right? So for example, for a cohort here, this could, the number 1, 2, 3 could refer to the month, right? So you could actually measure the revenue that you're getting from that particular cohort in subsequent months, right? And the thing is, if you add up the revenue that you are generating for each month, then essentially you're getting the full customer lifetime value, the full value of a customer, for each cohort, right? So you can essentially just add up the revenues that you're getting, right? So as mentioned at the start of the class, then the goal that you might want to set out to do is to increase that customer lifetime value, right? So maybe, in a particular week, you want to upsell different products and, try to increase that revenue you're collecting on a monthly basis, right? Now, the great thing is that once you have the customer lifetime value for each cohort, you can easily track how much money you're spending to acquire this cohort, right? So let's say you're running some marketing campaigns, and assuming that you can track, the users that have signed up through that campaign, right? You can, essentially calculate the return on investment, right? If you spend X dollars on this marketing campaign, were you able to get back more revenue and essentially achieve a return on your marketing investment? All right. So, with that, this can help you make better marketing and investment decisions. All right. Okay. So quick comments. I think Trisha mentioned about the session running to 7:30. So I believe the session will end at 7, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. All right, so I will power on, given that we are running a bit short on time. Give me 1 second. Okay. Right, so that is a cohort analysis, which is an analytical framework that can be used to help measure the impact of recurring revenue or recurring customer behavior. Now, another analytical framework you can use is known as a correlation analysis. And essentially with the correlation analysis, what you're doing is you are trying to understand if there is a relationship between two variables, right? So for example, let's say you are a business that sells ice cream, right? So you would have, let's say, over here we have a scatter plot, and you can plot the ice cream sales on your x-axis, and you can plot the temperature, all right, the weather temperature on the y-axis. And essentially, ideally you would see a positive correlation between ice cream sales and temperature, right? Because you would expect if the weather were very hot, you would expect customers to actually buy more of your ice cream, right? So if you're able to establish that relationship, right, then you can start looking out for the weather temperature, right? And then you can expect that in the summer months, or in in Singapore, if you're talking about June, whereby it's generally hotter, then you can stock up on more ice cream, right? Because there is that established relationship between temperature and ice cream. ice cream sales. All right. So what I've described over here, that's an example of a positive correlation, right? So the higher the temperature, the higher the ice cream sales, right? And when we talk about correlation analysis, that is measured by the correlation metric, which ranges from 1 all the way to -1. Right. So what this means is that if you have the metric of 1, it means that you have a perfect positive correlation. That means you have a very, very strong relationship between your two variables. Right. Now, you can have a metric that is of a lower magnitude, like 0.4. And over here, I have that visual representation of that. You notice that at 0.4, it becomes more difficult to establish that relationship, right? For example, just because you increase the temperature does not necessarily translate into sales. Now, correlation metric of 0 means that there is no relationship, right? So if you increase the magnitude of one variable, there is there is no reliable effect on your other variable. Okay. Now, I do want to highlight the concept of a negative correlation, right? So that's all the way to the end, and that's the inverse of what we have seen earlier with the ice cream sales example. And a negative correlation simply says that if a metric goes up, the other metric goes down, or the other variable goes down. So one example would be, say, you have temperature as one variable, and the other variable can be sales of hot beverages or soup. Right? So the higher the temperature, you would expect there to be lower sales of hot beverages and soup. Right? So you would expect that to be of a negative correlation. All right. So I've just covered 3 different frameworks. All right. But these are, so you can think of these as different tools in your toolbox, right, to solve problems. Right. But ultimately, I do want to stress that it's important to use the right technique that will answer questions to solve the problem that you're looking to solve. Right. So just because you know these frameworks doesn't mean you have to use them. And at the end of the day, it really depends on the business context and the business problem that you're trying to solve. All right. Okay, so once you have done your analysis and identify your insights, the next step would be to communicate them, right? To present those insights to your stakeholders, as well as present those recommendations, right? So some of the recommendations would be, as I mentioned earlier, stock up on ice cream sales in the summer months, right? So those are examples of recommendations. But together with the recommendations, typically you want to show how you arrived at that recommendation, right? So you want to essentially share your insights. And the best way to share your insights would be through data visualization, right? So what is data visualization? Now, data visualization is essentially about communicating complex ideas with clarity, precision, and efficiency. Right? So it's not just about charts, it's not just about creating fancy charts or creating animations. Really, it's just a way to communicate complex ideas in a way that's clear, precise, and efficient, right? And when we look at data visualization, there are different ways to visualize data. On the chart over here on the left, I have a non-exhaustive overview of the different charts you can use, right? Like bar charts, pie charts, all very familiar with folks, all right? But with visualization, there is also an art to it, right? Because it really depends on who your audience is and what is that key insight that you want to convey, right? So that would drive the decision around the appropriate chart to use. Now, in terms of how to build these charts, there are different tools that can help you build these visualizations. Now, if you're familiar with Excel, Excel can also create charts with your data sets. What I have here are more modern tools that can process massive amounts of data. Right, so some popular tools would be Tableau and Power BI. These are general data analytics and data visualization software that can process big data, right, on the scale of millions and millions of rows. Right, as you know, with Excel there are limits. Right, Excel can only open data sets of up to 1 million rows, whereas while these tools can process data on the scale of millions. Yeah. So these are very powerful tools to help you create beautiful visualizations. All right, so with that, I want to play this video to give folks a sense of how you should make use of visualizations to convey your insight. All right, so let me play this video for folks. Give me 1 second while I optimize video clip.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner. Well, what you have seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
All right. Give me one moment while I just bring us back to a particular clip. So, really great presentation, huh? Yeah, so, this is Hans Ronsling. He gave this a very animated presentation, and, you can observe how he's using, in this case, what's known as a bubble chart, right? Whereby you have, your axes represent two variables, and you have the color of the bubbles and the size of the bubbles representing other variables as well. So I personally love the bubble chart visualization because you can convey so much information, right? 4, 5, actually 6 variables within one visualization. Yeah. Now, in addition to the choice of the bubble chart, I want you all to think about how he did it as well, right? He didn't just present the chart. He essentially also weaved in a story, a narrative to help captivate our attention. Right? Of course, he used some, tools. For example, there is this animation to show how World War II impacted incomes and lifespans. But if you think about it, his general narrative is that the world is getting better, right? And he had all these data points to support his narrative. So one thing that I want to highlight is that it's not just about the chart itself or the choice of the charts. It's not just about animation or the data points, but it's also about what that narrative is. What is the story that you want to tell? Right? Because as humans, we remember stories. Right? Stories can help to captivate our attention and help us to retain information. Right? So do think about that story that you want to tell your audience and how the data, is in support of that story. Yeah. I saw a few questions. So in terms of the software, I'm not sure exactly what software they use to overlay this information. I think it's more of a video effects software. But the chart itself, it's a bubble chart, and you can actually create these charts in Tableau, right? And Power BI, if I'm not wrong. So it's a very, very powerful chart and can be created by very, very standard tools. Okay. All right. So moving on. Now, we talked about different charts you could use, and over here, I have some negative examples of how to, create charts and visualize data. So these are some bad examples. And, I think it's important to highlight that you can do a very deep analysis and your insights can be very sound, right? But if you do not present your data properly, then that can derail everything, right? Because this is essentially the last mile in which you're presenting your insights to stakeholders. So, in the interest of time, very quickly, you can see immediately why some visualizations are bad, right? The pie chart here, you have so many slices, you can barely make out what each slice refers to. Over here in this line chart, you'll notice that your time axis is not in regular intervals, which can help to distort your data, right? Because that can change the gradient of your slope. So this can be outright misleading. Now, the last chart over here, you'll notice that it's a stacked bar chart. And with stacked bar charts, you would expect each portion or each section to add up to 100% if you see percentages over here. But if you can see, the numbers, these numbers do not add up to 100, right? Over here, it's 91. Over here, it's 72%. Over here, it's 33%. So it can be very confusing, right? Because when you see stacked bar charts, you would expect the numbers to add up to 100%. All right, so do be mindful of these considerations as you decide the right visualization to use. Now, in the interest of time, I will just talk through this really quickly. So in terms of this visualization here, many of you might have seen it at the start of COVID. So this is the coronavirus dashboard created by the Johns Hopkins University. And I think one thing I wanted to highlight here was the color choice that they made, right? Because color might seem like a very minor decision, but the choice of color can impact how we feel, right? And if you think about it, for coronavirus, at the very start, there it was somewhat controversial. People were not sure or not they were not clear how serious it was, and perhaps I don't know this, but perhaps Johns Hopkins University, they wanted to sort of emphasize how serious it was. And by choosing dark colors like black and red, that can help to instill a sense of seriousness in your audience. Okay, so we have looked at data visualization and looked at the data analyst workflow and how we can make use of data from a day-to-day operations perspective, right? Now, let's take a step back to think about data strategy. So the power of data can be harnessed in multiple ways, right? What we have just seen with the data analyst workflow is how we have used data as insights, right? So we clean the data, prepare it, run the analysis, apply frameworks, and we're able to extract insights to improve decision-making. But data can also be used in other ways, right? Data can be provided as a service. Now, I was conducting this class for a group of social entrepreneurs and nonprofits previously, and one question one of them had was, do we need to invest in a database, right? And the answer is no, right? Not all companies or not all organizations need to invest in databases. And if you don't have a database or you don't have if you don't have the infrastructure set up, you can still use data to make better decisions by essentially subscribing to a service, all right, or obtaining data from a data service provider. One example over here would be John Deere, which is a company that manufactures farming equipment or agriculture equipment. And in addition to the traditional business of selling farming equipment, they also sell data service to essentially provide data on how farmers' crops are doing to help them make decisions on how to optimize crop yield, right? So it would be pretty unreasonable to expect every farmer to have his or her own database, right? And collect data and clean data and visualize data, right? What we have here is John Deere doing all of that and providing that as a service so that farmers can focus on what they do best, which is farming, right? Now, another way data can be used in business would be through data enhanced products. And over here, we have an example from AWS, which is the cloud business of Amazon. Now, Amazon started out as an e-commerce business in the 1990s. And through their experience handling high traffic volumes and building up e-commerce business, they have decided to sort of essentially use all of those learnings to develop cloud products that can benefit other, not just other retailers, but also other companies that want to have a web presence. All right. So in this case, Amazon is not sharing any of their data, but they use the data from their own business to help develop products that they sell, that they then sell to other businesses. Now, a quick note on machine learning. So I'm sure you've heard of machine learning, AI, and these are really hot buzzwords. So I'm going to spend some time to just unpack that a little. So the thing about machine learning is that machine learning is not new. Right? Machine learning has been around since the 80s. Right? Today, you may have heard about deep learning. Fundamentally, that's based on neural networks, and research on neural networks have started since the 1980s. Now, the reason why more people are talking about it today is because of two broad macro trends. Right? So the first macro trend is something that I talked about earlier, right? Greater digitalization. Now we're collecting massive amounts of data, right? And for the first time, we now have the cloud infrastructure to store and process this massive amounts of data at scale, right? So that's one macro trend. The other macro trend would be improvements in sort of the research and development in the space of machine learning, right? So deep learning, these are new sort of algorithms that have come out of universities and come out of the big technology companies, right? So because of the intersection and convergence of these macro trends, now you see an explosion of applications of machine learning, right? So, we have all experienced machine learning in some form, right? When you use your phone, your photo app recognizing faces, that's an application of machine learning. You have seen videos of Tesla, self-driving capabilities and, self-driving cars. That is also an application of machine learning. Or even voice transcription, right? When you say something and the app automatically transcribes and translates, what you're saying. So all of these are applications of machine learning. Now, the big question is, how can you apply machine learning, or how can you tap on this machine learning opportunity? Now, what the big companies are doing are, they are, hiring data scientists. They're expensive, very specialized people building algorithms. They are investing in computing resources to store and to process their data, right? So they're investing all this money into building these machine learning capabilities. But there are other ways to apply machine learning as well, right? So the great thing about these technology companies is that they want to make money from all of the investment they have made in hiring data scientists and creating these models, right? So what a lot of these companies do now is that they provide machine learning as a service, right? So for example, if you want to transcribe something, right, instead of building the model yourself, you can easily tap an API, or what's known as an API or a service of one of these cloud providers by essentially uploading the audio clip, and you get back the transcribed result, right? So they own the models, they own sort of the technical expertise, and they provide you that service of transcribing, and you get what you want. And most importantly, you get it in a way that's accessible, right? So it's typically low cost and it's pay per use. Right, so this is one way you can tap on machine learning and apply machine learning as a service. Now, the other great sort of trend in machine learning is sort of the movement, the open source movement, right? So a lot of these universities have open sourced a lot of packages, what's known as packages or libraries, which are basically pre-made Python code or computer code that can allow you to build your own models, right? So as long as you have the data, right, you can make use of these open source libraries to train your own model and apply that model and sort of apply machine learning in your respective companies and domains, right? So you don't have to actually build the algorithms from scratch. You can basically make use of someone else's code and feed in your own data, right? There's going to be some investment, right? You need someone who can still, interpret the results. You can write a bit of code. You may need to invest in getting the data. But it's relatively cheaper as compared to in the past, or building custom models, right? And of course, then the last stage would be what big companies are doing, which would be investing heavily in data scientists, in compute costs to build customized models, right? But the key headline is that today there are different options to apply machine learning to drive impact in your business, all right? Now, data can also help to give your organization a competitive edge, right? And data, we can do so in several ways, right? Now, one approach would be to have a unique data set, right? So can this data set be purchased from other sources or easily copied or reverse engineered, right? So I think there was an earlier question on, where do we get the data, right? Yes, there are all these different data sources that you can collect data from, but I think one question after that would be, how can you actually, have this data source or data set give or grant your business a competitive edge, right? Could it be the unique insight that you're getting from it, right? Could it be that you're combining this public data set with an internal data set? And because you are able to combine these two data sets together, now you have new insight, right? So do think about, how unique that data set is. Maybe the data set, everyone has access to that data set, and now it becomes table stakes, right? And if you don't do it, you're gonna lose out, right? So that's one important consideration. Another consideration would be how relevant that data set is over time, right? Does the data become stale over time? Is there always going to be new data, right? Do you always need to keep up and acquire that new, fresher data set? Does the data set have network effects, right? Are you able to use the data from one user to help improve the product for the same user or for other users, right? So one example could be recommendation systems, right? For Netflix, because you have a lot of users using the service, now you're able to essentially get a sense of what people might like to watch based on their historical viewing habits and based on what other people have watched as well. Now, another competitive advantage would be the rapid learning cycle, right? So how quickly can we get insights? Right? We talked about accessing the data from a database, having you apply different analytical frameworks. If your organization is able to empower individuals to access data quickly, to empower individuals, train them to apply these different frameworks, to apply different machine learning approaches, that itself could be a competitive edge when you're able to execute quickly. Right? And of course, the last competitive edge would be segment of one. Right? How can you provide personalized, superior, personalized customer service? Right? So, people talk about Amazon's product recommendations as being top, world class, and that and that's secret sauce that no one else knows, right? And that's very powerful in driving sales for Amazon. Right. So we talked about data, using data as an individual. We talked about data as having that competitive advantage as a business. I did want to also talk about data privacy, given how we have been seeing headlines, of companies getting hacked and having these data being leaked out. Right. So data security is absolutely important, and it is a key risk for all organizations, as long as you deal and collect data. So some important considerations, right, as you deal with data, right? Do consider what is considered personal information, right? Now, personal information is anything that can be used to identify an individual, and it's more than just a name or address, right? The sound of their voice, a tattoo on the arm, these could be ways to identify an individual. Now, it's really important to understand what you're collecting and what you're going to do with it, right? Now, don't just collect data for the sake of collecting. Do have clear data policies in place, right? For example, ensure that your employees working with data destroy or de-identify data that you no longer need. Now, another approach that you can take, another recommendation would be to ensure that you protect all of the information you handle, right? Now, one approach would be to ensure that all of your data is encrypted and that you remove or separate your personal identifiable data from your behavioral data, right? So for example, examples of behavioral data would be, say, interaction, customer interaction with your website, right? So the interaction itself, how many clicks, how many button clicks, what were the buttons, how long they stay on the website, all of that behavioral data, right, can be separated from the data that will identify, your individual customers, right? So do ensure that those are separated and encrypted. All right, so those are some tips. I'm not a data lawyer, so definitely do consult your legal counsel. But I think the key headline here is to be very mindful of data and data security and privacy. All right, so we're about to reach the end of the presentation. And I think one thing I want to add is that, when it comes to using data and making decisions with data, it might sound obvious, but if you do not have the data, then there's nothing you can do, right? So for many organizations, the first step is really about acquiring the data, right? So if you have, a product or a service, where you can collect the data easily, the first step is to build those systems to collect data. Or you might have to buy data or purchase data, right? But be it using monetary resources or putting in time and manpower resources, ultimately you need to consider how you invest in data before you do any of the fun stuff, right? Now here's one case study centered around Spotify, right? So if you think about Spotify now, it's ubiquitous, right? Everyone has Spotify, it's very popular. But if you think about it, Apple Music entered the markets. Apple was around, since the early 2000s. Right? Apple was, it's a gorilla in the space, and Spotify is relatively new. It's a relatively young company. But today, Spotify is the market leader because of some of the, one of the key benefits, sort of competitive advantages was the curated playlists that served Spotify. Right? So even though Apple had a much bigger catalog, it was preloaded. Spotify had these curated playlists that its users loved, right? And over time, this was one of the key features that gave Spotify an edge over Apple Music. So do think about how you want to invest in your data to give you that competitive edge. And as we now see more platforms being released and being built, this opens up avenues to collect more data than ever before in the future. Right? Today we have voice assistants. Companies like Apple, they're working on AR, VR products. Facebook talked about the metaverse and how they're going to shift towards sort of increased emphasis on VR. You have Internet of Things, which are essentially cheap sensors that are collecting data, right? For example, your smart doorknobs or doorbells, your smart cameras in home or your baby cameras, right? All of these have sensors that are always collecting data. So as more and more platforms are built, we're going to see a lot more opportunities to analyze different types of data. All right. And with that, I've come to the end of the presentation. All right. So if folks are interested, I've included some links here to additional resources. I believe Hong will be sharing the slides, if I'm not wrong. Do correct me if I'm wrong. But regardless, thank you so much for. Okay, so we're not sharing the slides. So maybe I'll just pause here for a moment if folks want to take a screenshot of these resources. But thank you so much for taking time out of your Tuesday, coming out of the long weekend and jumping into this course. I hope it was a helpful overview of how data can be used in business, right? In terms of as an individual person in a business, or as a founder or a CEO of a company or organization, thinking about how to use data in a strategic way. All right. And with that, I've come to the end. Thank you once again, and have a great evening, everybody. And I hope to see folks in other sessions at General Assembly. And thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, before the session ends, please scan the QR code and provide your feedback or comments on the webinar. And lastly, I would like to share with you about our Skills and Training Advisory Service. If you're not sure how to get started on your upskilling journey, you can sign up for the free one-to-one Skills and Training Advisory session, where a skills ambassador will guide you in understanding your career goals and provide suitable course recommendations. Simply scan on the QR code and indicate SFMX Smart Nation in the mandatory field, how do you hear about us, at the bottom of the registration form. Our skills ambassadors will contact you within 2 to 3 working days. We have come to the end of our webinar and we thank you for joining us. Hope you have gained important insights from our speaker. Thank you and hope to see you in the other sessions.